being here today to watch my presentation, and huge thank you to Dr. Bond for working with me on this project because she was super supportive and encouraging and just a really awesome person to work with on this. So yeah, my topic is art therapy practitioners' perspectives working with autism spectrum disorder. A couple definitions I just want to get out of the way before I get into it are number one, art therapy, and that is a mental health profession that enriches the lives of individuals, families, and communities through active art making, creative process, applied psychological theory, and human experience within a psychotherapeutic relationship. So a couple things to point out about that definition is just the variety in groups of people that art therapists work with. Can be individuals, can be groups, variety of diagnosis, or even those without diagnosis, maybe had some kind of trauma, or just a really big variety of different people that they work with. And then also, the psychotherapeutic relationship is just a really big component of art therapy as well. And then I want to talk a little bit about autism because I think there tends to be a little bit of misconception around that diagnosis. A lot of people think that it's a learning disability, and it's not. So autism is pretty often comorbid with learning disabilities, but it isn't one itself. So what autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by two core areas, those being persistent challenges in social communication and interaction, and then repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So when autism spectrum disorder is being diagnosed, the diagnostic criteria fall under these two major categories. So what some of the symptoms might look like is trouble with eye contact, communication, connection, just verbalizing, and then that repetitive patterns of behavior. A lot of times that's what people think of as their special interests or hyperfixations, where they're just repeatedly engaging with the same thing or engaging in the same type of behavior. So why is this topic important? The use of art therapy is just becoming increasingly common with the autism diagnosis. However, there's limited resources and research on using art therapy specifically with this diagnosis. And it's really important for us to have that research because increased understanding leads to increased support. So several of my participants shared that they were initially hesitant to actually take on clients with the autism diagnosis because they didn't really feel confident doing so, just because there isn't a lot of resources out there for practitioners to understand kind of like what are the best practices for using art therapy with these individuals. So a few things I want to touch on from my literature review. Number one is just how do you become an art therapist? So to become an art therapist, you must complete a master's degree, practice hours, and pursue credentialing. So it's pretty similar to just being a regular counselor or therapist. There's different titles, and that kind of depends on what state they're practicing in, but that can be a registered art therapist or board-certified art therapist. Both of these are credentialed art therapists that can practice art therapy. And then some settings they might work in include schools, hospitals, inpatient facilities, and private practice. So some benefits that I came across in the literature of art therapy are number one, physical and psychological growth. So art therapy is kind of unique in that it offers both the physical and psychological side of things. So you're working with emotions and things like that, but you're also doing something physically. So you're able to kind of benefit in both of those areas. And then provides a means of nonverbal communication, enhances emotional openness and recognition, improves confidence and self-esteem, and improves distress tolerance. So I will get into those ones a little bit more in detail in my results section. And then just some considerations for art therapists that I came across in literature are therapists working with this population should be neurodivergent informed. So it's important for them to understand the autism diagnosis and neurodivergence, and just know like what are the best practices for working with these individuals specifically, because it can be different from just the general population. And it's also necessary to offer a safe and predictable environment, especially important with individuals with autism because they just thrive more in a predictable, routine type of environment. And then safety and sensory considerations, very dependent on the individual and their level of autism. But a lot of times they might have sensory sensitivities, as well as you have to kind of consider how they're perceiving the materials that you're using. And then a few limitations of art therapy. There tends to be a little bit of overlap between art therapy and other disciplines because lots of other types of therapists do incorporate art into their therapy. So that leads to some confusion about what actually is art therapy and what is an art therapist, as opposed to just any other therapist using art in their therapy. And then again, there's a little bit of a lack of research about art therapy because it's a relatively new and developing field. And then art therapy is not always covered by insurance because it just hasn't become a super common therapy to use yet. So in my actual study, my methods were that my participants included credentialed art therapists who are currently working or who have previous experience working with youth diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and I had a total of 6 participants. So to collect my data, I used a 12-question semi-structured interview, and semi-structured meaning I had a set of 12 questions, and if I wanted to expand or add questions as they came up, I did that. And then I did those all over Zoom, and they were recorded. The interviews lasted 35 to 75 minutes. So when it came to analyzing the data, we used a qualitative research design, and then I used thematic analysis, which I coded manually. And if you're not familiar with thematic analysis, and I was not when I started this process, basically what you're doing is taking all of the information from all the interviews and just summarizing and organizing it and finding what are the key takeaways, what are the similarities between what all the participants are saying, and then kind of the overarching ideas you get from that is what you call your themes at the end. So this was really time consuming to do manually, but I'm actually really glad that I did it that way because I got super familiar with the data and learned a lot and really have a lot more to take away from it even than I can put in this presentation. So that was awesome. And so after I did that manually, then we took that and compared it with AI, the themes that AI developed. So we just put the interviews into ChatGPT and had it develop as themes also, just as a way to make sure that in case there's anything that I was missing. And I will say it came up with really similar stuff to what I had. All the content was almost the same, other than one thing we might change going forward was that we liked the wording, the way they worded some of the titles of the themes. So that was really the only major thing that we might change going forward. So the themes that I came up with were professional demographics, relationships in art therapy practice, therapeutic goals and effectiveness, creation and implementation of art therapy interventions, benefits and limits of art therapy, and considerations and resources for art therapists. So first of all, some of my questions just at the beginning of the interviews included a little bit about the participants' professional identity. So one thing that they all had in common was that they all shared an early interest in art and wanted to pursue that as a career going forward. And then some of the settings they worked in included multidisciplinary group practice, solo and group private practice, inpatient psychiatric hospital, and then one was a clinical director at a community mental health agency. And then several of my participants also had a personal interest in the autism diagnosis and have sought specialized training outside of just their master's program and credentialing in art therapy. And then the states that they practice in include Nebraska, South Dakota, Colorado, Kansas, and Connecticut. So the next theme that I came up with was relationships in art therapy practice, and I kind of broke this one down into 3 sub-themes. One of those being collaboration. So collaboration is huge as an art therapist, especially when working with youth. Parents are a huge component, and the therapist is going to do a lot of collaboration with them. So typically the parents are the ones bringing them in the first place at this age, so they're going to really be big in goal setting and what are the goals going to be for these clients. And then it goes both ways though, because you're also going to talk to parents about assessing effectiveness. So what are they seeing outside of the practice, and like what are the clients meeting their goals outside of therapy to make sure that what you're doing in the session is translating outside of the practice. And then when it comes to schools kind of the same way, might be part of the goal setting, and then you might be asking them about effectiveness. But also, the therapist can really be an advocate for the client in the school district to make sure that they're getting the accommodation that they need. And then coworkers, depending on the setting, you might have coworkers that you collaborate with. And one of my participants mentioned that it can really be nice to have coworkers because it can make the field just less isolating, and you have people to lean on, build trust with, and also have a sense of accountability. And you're able to just collaborate to make sure you're best meeting the needs of your clients. And then with art therapy especially, there's a lot of collaboration with the client, again on goal setting, and then the interventions you're actually doing, a lot of times you're collaborating with the client on what are we doing in session, like what are we going to create and do art-wise as well. And then something I also thought was interesting was one of my participants mentioned clients actually collaborating with each other. So they did a community project where the clients would all actually work on the same project. Just a way to kind of connect and collaborate while still maintaining that privacy and boundaries that are necessary to show that just they're all kind of interconnected as well. And then when it comes to the therapeutic relationship, almost everyone mentioned that this is just a super important and major component of the therapy and something that you're actively working on, building that trust, building that rapport. And it's super important because it helps the client be more comfortable, and having that feeling comfortable and having trust with the therapist is going to help them to be open to trying new things and stepping outside of their comfort zone, which is really necessary so that you can get them to do things that are going to help them grow. If they're just staying within their comfort zone, they're not going to be meeting the goals that you need them to meet. And then they also mentioned therapeutic repair. So sometimes you are going to make a mistake as a therapist, and it's really important to be able to take accountability for that. And the therapeutic repair usually involves having just really open conversations, whether that be with the client or the parents, and just saying, you know, here's what I did wrong, here's what we're going to do differently going forward. And then referral is a component of therapy as well. Sometimes the therapist simply is not the right fit with the client. And several of the participants mentioned just the importance of recognizing that and knowing when you aren't the right fit. Really kind of checking your ego and knowing that you're just not always going to be the perfect person for every client. So it's important when referral is necessary to just be really mindful in how you handle that. That's going to be, referral can potentially be damaging to the client if you aren't really careful and just supportive in the process and making sure that you're supporting them and finding what is going to work for them, because you don't want to be another person that is abandoning them in their mind. So just being really careful, having conversations with parents about, okay, here's what we tried, and like making sure you're trying a variety of things and taking a long time with the client to try to build a relationship. And then if it isn't working, saying, here is what we tried, here's why it isn't working, and here's what you might benefit from instead. So then, yes, the client might simply benefit more from other services, whether that be a different therapist who has a different personality, a different gender maybe, or a different style of therapy, or depending on their needs, sometimes they might need more specialized services. So, for example, they might need like occupational therapy or something like that might be just more important than the art therapy, depending on their needs. So, therapeutic goals and effectiveness was my next theme, and when it comes to the goals that these therapists are working on with clients, there's really a wide range because the treatment is very individualized depending on the client. And again, like I said, it can be emotional goals, it can be physical goals, you're working on both of those things, or it can be a combination. So it's very unique to the individual. But a few of them that I saw kind of come up more than others included emotional regulation, distress tolerance, and increased self-esteem and identity. So the emotional regulation, just being able to identify emotions and better understand those, and then, you know, when the client becomes dysregulated, how are we going to become regulated and make sure that they're able to do that on their own. Distress tolerance, a lot of times the way that the therapists are working on that is through sensory exposure. So, for example, say the client is really distressed initially on using paint. So you might like slowly work up to being able to use that material, although that typically isn't about using the material itself. It's about we are working on being uncomfortable and being able to be uncomfortable and work up to being able to use this thing, and hopefully that translates to other areas of their life. And then increased self-esteem and identity. A lot of these individuals just have negative views of themselves, whether that be internal or stigma from society. And so that's just really important, just building their confidence and making them understand that it's okay to be who they are. And then when it comes to assessing the effectiveness of art therapy interventions, there's really no universal way of doing this. However, all of my participants mentioned just simply the use of observable progress. So if it's something like distress tolerance, could they use this material then? Are they more comfortable now? How often are they approaching this material? And then, or it could be emotional things like, okay, when we brought this up in the past, you just immediately shut down, but now we can talk about it. Different things like that that you just might see them progressing in that way. However, one of my participants did mention the use of standardized measures, and she said that this can be beneficial in communicating results or basically where the client is at with other professionals or parents. So she mentioned the use of the Silver drawing test and formal elements art therapy scale. These are two standardized arts-based assessments. And she kind of gave an example of, she had a client who she felt like needed further testing on something and the parents disagreed. So she implemented one of these measures and could clearly show, here is where they're at developmentally, and could translate that with the parents and professionals just in a really concrete way. So that's kind of the benefit of doing that versus just kind of, here's what I saw. And then when it comes to the creation and implementation of art therapy interventions, the number one thing that the participants brought up was just the use of client-led interventions. So really what that means is that the client is going to be number one in what it is you're doing. That you're considering their preferences, their interests, and then a lot of times the therapist will come in just with a really basic idea and collaborate with the client on where are we going to take this and what are we going to do. Or they might bring something in and the client doesn't want to do that at all. So then they're going to just have a lot of options and materials, and the client can kind of do what it is that they need to do. And again, there's no universal interventions for the autism diagnosis that work. So there's not just a list of, here are the best things that you can do with this diagnosis. And that really goes for any diagnosis. When it comes to art therapy, there just isn't a set specific group of interventions that are going to be best for any group of people. They're very, very, very unique. So one thing that is really helpful with the autism diagnosis is incorporating their special interests into the interventions. So just for example, say we're back to the client who was becoming distressed by using paint. So we're trying to encourage them, how are we going to help them want to use this paint? Say their special interest is Pokemon. So we're going to paint a Pokemon today. They're going to be a lot more willing to try that out than to just say, let's paint a tree or something like that. Something that they already want to engage with, they're motivated to do that. They're going to be a lot more motivated to try what you want them to. And then it also offers a shared language. So something they're already comfortable talking about and engaging with. Sometimes therapy can be intimidating and talking about emotions can be difficult. So having that language that you can share with them can be really helpful. So say with a Pokemon, you might say, okay, this Pokemon character experienced this, and how might they feel, and what might they do, rather than talking about them directly, because they might struggle to talk about themselves, but oh, I can talk about this in a different lens. And then some considerations that need to be made also include safety, sensory factors, client needs and preferences, and adaptations. So one example that comes to mind was that one of my participants mentioned that she had a client who wanted to make slime, but they were really uncomfortable with it sensory-wise. So she's like, we went through an entire box of latex gloves in order to make this slime, and that's just an example of meeting their needs and preferences, adaptations, and sensory-wise. So even something that simple can just make that more accessible for them. And then they also may incorporate other approaches, for example, like CBT and DBT, like some of the bigger counseling theories. And that can be beneficial too for insurance purposes, number one, because sometimes insurance is more likely to pay for that if you are incorporating other theories. And then it also just offers multiple avenues of reinforcement. So say what you're doing didn't quite get the idea through, having a backup or just other approaches that you're integrating can help reinforce those ideas. So some of the benefits and limits of art therapy. I think the biggest benefit of art therapy is just that it doesn't require verbal communication. And this is really, really awesome for this particular group of people, because that is one of the major two things that they struggle with in the first place, is that communication. And so art therapy offers a way to have a therapeutic relationship without it solely being about the verbal communication. And then it also offers a new means of communication. So a lot of times these individuals might have kind of frustration over the fact that they can't express themselves, and this offers a new way for them to express. And one of my participants said specifically that art becomes their language. And so I think that was just a really awesome quote, but it can help them really release that frustration and find a new way of expressing themselves because it doesn't rely on verbal communication. And then also, super beneficial that you can incorporate special interests, basically like what I said before. It can just help them with motivation and help them to enjoy the therapy. It's also highly adaptable. There's tons of different materials you can use and interventions you can try. Just creativity can be really adapted to meet the needs of a lot of different people. And it's also enjoyable. It doesn't feel like the typical therapeutic relationship, and it doesn't feel like just work on skills. And so then some of the limits, one of those is just effectiveness can depend on client interests. Some people don't like art, and some people don't want to engage with art materials. And my participants said typically they can find a way to meet in the creative place with these people, but sometimes if people are just completely unwilling to be creative, they just might not benefit most from art therapy. They might benefit more from a different type of therapy. And then sensory challenges. So, you know, I talked about working on sensory sensitivities in art therapy, but for some, if they just become too distressed and dysregulated using those materials, they just aren't able to do so, then the therapy might not be beneficial for them. And then some clients just might benefit more from specialized services. So as you might have noticed, a lot of the limits, at least that my participants mentioned, were really on an individual basis rather than about the practice itself. So some considerations and resources for art therapists. Number one, the importance of adaptability, ethical practice, and accountability. So adaptability and flexibility were two of the words that just came up over and over and over. As an art therapist, you really got to think on your toes. You're always figuring out how to best meet the needs of the client. Where are they at emotionally? And that can change from day to day, that can change during the session. You're just always kind of adapting the interventions to best meet their needs. Ethical practice, considering your own limits as a therapist and considering the limits of the practice, and being able to take accountability and knowing when you can't best meet needs of an individual. And knowing that despite your training and education, you might not always be the expert in the client's needs. So again, like I said before, in checking your ego, but like knowing that the client might know better than you do about themselves, and knowing even their parents sometimes might know better than you do. So really just taking everything into consideration rather than just what you think you know. And then there are challenges for art therapists with external expectations and pressure. So schools, parents, workplace, insurance also is all going to have ideas and telling you about what you should be doing and how fast you should be making progress and things like that. So just being really confident and knowing what you're doing in the practice is what's best. And then this one was interesting to me, but the importance of client individuality. So really being aware that people in the client's life might actually be wanting that client to change more for their convenience than for the client's benefit. So just being really careful when you're setting those goals and considering, you know, are we trying to fundamentally change this person? Because at the end of the day, everyone has a right to be an individual, and you want them to accept who they are, not fundamentally change who they are. So finding ways to compromise, you know, you might talk with the family, how can they better support the client while the client is also working on themselves? So it's more of a meet in the middle rather than putting all the pressure on the client to change. And then when it comes to resources, there is a lack of specific resources, and several of my participants mentioned that. They did mention that it can be helpful to find resources that are created by neurodivergent individuals because they sometimes have a better understanding of that population. One reason for the lack of resources could be that therapists working in the field just don't have the time to put out resources. So the people that are actually working with these individuals and have the knowledge about it just don't have the time to be putting out research. And then again, this is a problem because this less knowledge leads to more hesitancy around offering these services, and I think these services can be really beneficial. So a few limitations of this study. Number one, we didn't include telehealth services, and I do think that some of my participants offer these, but we just didn't talk about it in the interviews, so it wasn't included in the study. All my participants had female gender expression, so we didn't have any male presenting participants. And then we gathered participants through professional networks rather than putting out like a national call, so that possibly could have limited the participants we got. And then did not ask for any self-identified demographic information, so we didn't ask for like age, gender, race, things like that. So we can't technically be 100% sure that our sample is representative of the entire population. And then our inclusion criteria was a little bit broad. We just said as long as you've worked with these individuals, we didn't say you should have this amount of experience working with these individuals. So if we had more specific criteria there, we might have gotten some different results. And so my major takeaways from this, although I feel like there's a lot more, but number one, the use of client-led interventions and individualized care. I really think that's kind of the essence of art therapy. So allowing the clients to be the leader in their care and really personalizing it to them and making it unique to their needs and goals. And then also just the importance and benefit of incorporating special interests, and then art therapy not relying on verbal communication. I think those are the two major things that makes art therapy make so much sense for the autism diagnosis. I would say those are just two of the biggest benefits of it in my mind. And then that kind of leads into the importance of increased research, because this can be so beneficial for these individuals and because it just makes so much sense for the diagnosis. It's really important that we do increase the research on this so that our practitioners are more confident taking on these clients, and the therapists that are currently working with these clients know about what are the best practices in working with these individuals. And so we are hoping to publish this information over the summer to help meet this research gap. That is my presentation.